Please do.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Trade Policy Research Forum webinar. We've got a great session today. There's been a lot of interest out there, so we're very lucky to have a great panel of speakers, and Hannah will introduce them in a moment. Let me say a couple of words before we start about what the forum is and what we try to do. So I'm Ben Shepherd with my co-founder, Hannah Norberg. We started the Trade Policy Research Forum about 2.5 years ago as an online forum to try and recreate the atmosphere of a brown bag seminar. I should say to recreate it without all the really annoying questions. So to keep it friendly, to keep it positive, and to keep it informative. You can see that our logo looks a little bit like a bridge, specifically the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which says something about my accent. And what we try to do is build bridges in a number of different ways. One is to build bridges between research and practice. So it's very important to us to have high quality researchers as we have today. But also we know we have a lot of practitioners watching. So to make that transition from research to policy is a big part of what we're about. We also want to build bridges between trade policy in different parts of the world. So we know that a lot of trade policy discussions go on in Washington, Brussels, and Geneva, and a lot of people around the world who are studying trade policy don't have access to those discussions. So we're trying to bring high quality research and policy discussion to participants in places where they may not have access to these sorts of discussions on a regular basis. Then the final set of bridges that we're trying to build is between different parts of the trade policy profession. So economists on the one hand, but also lawyers, political scientists, and policy specialists, all of us working together on trade policy. So I can see that we've got a good number of attendees in the room already. Like I say, we're looking forward to a great session on artificial intelligence and trade. So let me hand over to Hannah to introduce our speakers.
Thank you so very much for that, Ben. So many of our friends are here today. Here's Leonard and Maria and Irene and Hildegun and Andrea and Arushi. And I see so many of our friends and colleagues here today. This is a super exciting webinar that we have today. So we are lucky enough to have Professor Daniel Trefler here. So he is the Professor of Economic Analysis and Policy at the University of Toronto, and he has been my idol for a very long time. I'm just going to say that right away, so I can then keep the fangirling in check. So he wrote the Theory of a Missing Trade paper back in the day. And then we have a returning customer and panelist in Javier, who is a senior trade policy analyst at the OECD. And the topic could not be more exciting in general, trade and AI, but also more timely. So I'm just going to cut it super short and get out right now so that we can start with the discussions right away. So without further ado, Dan, I'm going to hand it to you, and you're going to have about 20 minutes. Before we start, though, I have to say that according to GDPR rules, I'm now doing the housekeeping, so that we are recording this. And so whatever so by staying on here, you're consenting to us using whatever images or sounds that you may be putting in here. This will be recorded. This will be up on our YouTube channel and on our website. Oh, and super exciting news. We are launching a brand new website. It's just coming live. It has changed, but it hasn't come up live yet. So within the next day or so, everything will change, and it's really gorgeous. And we are so grateful for the team that has done that for us. All that information will be on the website. So please, we would very much like this to be not a monologue, but a conversation. So as usual, don't be shy. Put questions in the Q&A or in the chat box for us. Keep them going keep them coming all the time, and then we'll summarize them. Or if Dan and Javier would like to take them as they go, that's completely up to them. But without further ado, I'm super excited to hand it over to you, Dan.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, Hannah. And Ben, thank you so much for having me here. It is a time for building bridges could not be more important. It's a time when academics are being marginalized from policy discussions intentionally by politicians who do not want to be informed by facts. And we feeling it, Javier and I had a discussion about that yesterday. And the other bridge that needs to be built is in a world in which we are increasingly doing battle East and West, specifically over two issues, which is international trade, and the second one is AI, and it's a dual-use technology. So an important bridge between East and West has to be built, and having conversations like this is super important for preventing the hawks in the room from taking control and leading to hopefully not war. And finally, I want to thank Javier. We have so many points of contact that we didn't appreciate until we had a conversation yesterday. So really looking forward to your comments. Let me put up my slide. Give me one moment just to share the screen. All right, is that all clearly visible to everybody? Great. All right, so apologies. My technology is stuck here. Okay, great. So let's start with something obvious, which is AI is increasingly important in the world economy. Just as one simple illustration, what we just went through last month when Microsoft released its version of chatbot, it did so late in the day on February 6th. Its stock price proceeded to go up by $123 billion. I know we're inured to big numbers. That's a big number. Google chatbot released its attempt just after February 6th, when the stock market closed. But in anticipation, the Google stock climbed, and then there was an error that was discovered in the Google chatbot, and Google stock price went down by $100 billion. So these are big numbers. Maybe later we can talk about whether it was really, Google really did have an error that I'm not sure that I would consider it an error. I think the stock market has dramatically overreacted to that, to what happened. But hopefully Google will come back with a vengeance in future months. All right, so one of the things that we're interested in when it comes to international trade and AI is the emergence of superstar firms. And when we think about superstar firms, we certainly immediately reach out to a space occupied by companies like Facebook and Google. Increasingly, ByteDance is in the news. Or if you're from China, you will hear a lot about Alibaba and Tencent. And what you see is among the American firms, and this holds for almost all firms from almost all countries except China, that there's a huge amount of globalization as measured by the share of, say, Facebook's downloads that are coming from outside of the United States, from outside of the home country of Facebook. That number is over 90%. For Google, it's pushing 90%. So really, really remarkable how these firms are growing because of their ability to access foreign markets. Alibaba and most of you will know Tencent because of WeChat. But WeChat, unfortunately, although it has almost 100% penetration within China, big trust issues about why it hasn't reached outside of China. And then we might add, why doesn't Facebook have a higher penetration? Because it's banned internationally, because it's banned in China. Likewise for many Google products. All right, another slice at this international trade in AI is just to look, I want to look a little bit back here to 2020, before the tech stock started to decline. If at that point you had looked at the largest companies by market cap, the 8 largest companies in the world by market cap, you would have seen a number of things. In column 3, you'll see that all of them were very substantial investors in AI. That is, they had many AI patents. Tesla doesn't have a lot of AI patents, but we all know that Tesla is very much an AI-driven enterprise. Another thing to realize is that from column 4 is that most of these companies had very little presence in the top 500 of the FT just 10 years earlier, in 2011. And then the final thing you'll notice is the nationality, that all of these countries are either based in the US or China. And for the rest of the planet, this is deeply concerning to the extent that these two countries hold a lot of the intellectual property surrounding AI. There is Kai-Fu Lee makes this point that, does this mean that the rest of the world is going to be paying royalties to these two countries? These two countries will enrich themselves on the backs of all the other countries in the world. That is an open question. I wouldn't say that it's for sure going to happen, but it's certainly one that we should all be at least a little bit concerned of, because it has many, many ramifications, from our individual privacy all the way to the nature of war on the planet. All right. Another thing to realize about these companies is, in some of the markets that they operate in, not all, but in some of the markets they operate in, these are highly concentrated markets. The one that I'm studied the most is global ad revenue in the mobile app industry. And what you see is the blue line is Google's ad revenues, which is in 2020 was over $150 billion. And then running up, we had Facebook, which has obviously run into some problems since then, Amazon, and far behind Twitter. So you can see from the dashed red line that not only are these companies earning a lot of money from ad revenues, but just these four companies control 71% of all global ad revenue. So in this particular area, these companies have dominant market positions, and that should concern us from a welfare perspective. I want to emphasize that one has to be very cautious about how we talk about market concentration in this world, and how quickly things can turn around for companies, go south or go north. Another thing about AI that we're deeply concerned about is its implications for distribution of inequality, distribution of wealth, both within countries and across countries. All of us, in some sense, if we're worried about rich and poor countries and trying to narrow the development gap, we do have to recognize that as much as China has caught up with us, China still, on a per capita basis, is still far behind rich countries. For those of us who go visit China and we go to a city like Beijing, or we hang out, in Pudong in Shanghai, these look like extraordinarily affluent places, but there's large swaths of China which are not as wealthy. And the idea that technology is helping China catch up, and it still has a long way to go in many ways, I think is heartwarming for all of us. That said, if AI is going to displace jobs, it has big implications domestically. And just to give you a simple example, when we think about what jobs are going to be gained and lost from AI, you need to stop thinking about jobs and start thinking about what tasks are done in that job. One way of thinking about tasks is, are they routine non-cognitive, in which case anybody can do it and can be mechanized, and probably AI can do it. The next is routine cognitive, which is on an assembly line, say, doing welding. And you might think, oh, well, robotics is going to take all that space, take that space over, and that will hollow out all of the blue-collar jobs in the West. I'm not so sure that exactly how that's going to play out, but I do want to offer a note of caution as we move into sort of a manufacturing 4.0 world, that when you look at this picture in the middle right of your screen about an automated factory, I want you to notice that people often focus on what's in the picture and rather than what's not in the picture. And what's in the picture is robots. It's really an amazing technological achievement that we could have a lights off factory with no people. But what's striking is why there are no people. Is it because we don't want people there because robots can do everything? Or is it, which is probably closer to the truth, that if you put robots next to people, those robots tend to do physical damage to people, like lop off their heads? And in fact, it's a big problem for robotics that there's many things robots can't do, and it would be better if they could work with people. So we have a job to be done. Robots can do some of the tasks. Humans can do the rest of those tasks. We're trying to figure out how to put them together, And this highlights the idea that what impacts AI will have on jobs will very much depend on which tasks AI can do. And there's many tasks AI cannot yet do. And whether the tasks that AI can do will complement or substitute for workers. We thought that AI would substitute for radiologists, for instance. Radiologists read images, and AI can certainly do a pretty good job of reading images today. So we don't need radiologists anymore, would be the claim. And yet radiologists are doing a booming business, more so than ever before. And that is in part because now they can read more images, they can focus on the images that AI is struggling with, and they can do what they've always been doing, which is communicating results to patients, something AI is not yet capable of doing, and running hospitals, running imaging labs, which AI cannot do. And then where AI is going to displace jobs is really going to be much more gunshot than people realize. So, for example, Wall Street, of all, outside of high tech, Wall Street is the main adopter of AI. And what you see is that AI is displacing very high-end jobs. So the picture of what AI is going to do for inequality remains still very, very vague. And it'll take some years before we get any clarity on that. All right. What I wanted to talk about a little bit more is some of my own specific research. Hannah tells me that there's going to be a lot of students and PhD students out there, and that you spend some time investing in understanding gravity approaches. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and I want to talk a little bit about how we use AI in research as academics. So this is a study of the mobile app industry. And I spent a very long time trying to understand, how do we write a paper about AI and international trade? Like, what impacts is international trade having on AI? And very hard to know. There's so many different use cases for AI, and each of them is very specific, and we don't have data on any of them. And then after thinking about, I've been thinking and working on AI since about 2015. And after thinking about it for about 3 years, the penny dropped. And I realized, I'm holding in my hand this thing which either uses AI on it directly, which is a bit uncommon, or uses AI in the cloud. So you send up information or queries to the app host site, and it sends you back an answer. So there's a ton of information that we have about these AI in these apps. And we also know who's using these apps everywhere in the planet, because you can go to Apple Store or you can go to Google Play and find out exactly how many people in Nigeria are using Google Chrome. So we took these data. It's just extraordinarily large data, but that's the world that we live in now. From that data, we know about the app, including lots of characteristics about the app. For instance, we know what the app does because there's a description of the app. We know the firm that owns the app. We know where that firm is from, the headquarters country. We know who's using the app. In other words, what is the importing country? And for us, we have that from 2016 to 2020, and we'll be updating that soon by another 2 years. We picked off 2,000 of the biggest firms. You'll see why in a minute. And we're using the largest apps. We're using those firms' apps, which is 100,000 apps. And we've got 84 countries that we're importing from. Okay, so that is sort of the core dependent variable, if you will. How much are countries importing the digital services from other countries, and where those digital services are embodied in trade, in app usage. And now to add in AI into this, we know about the firms. We know which firms, what patents the firms had. Once we know what patents the firm has, we can figure out which of those patents deal with AI. For that, we simply have to go to the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Office, and they have they give instructions on how to identify AI patents. So that's easy to do. For each patent, we have all the text of the patent. And then here's where I'll just take a minute to explain, because I think it will be useful for students to understand. You're being told that these chatbots are amazing new technology that no one has seen before. So that's just really misleading. We've had since 2018 the foundational or large language models. And what we do in our own research is take Google's version of these large language models, which they have trained on patent data, which is hugely helpful for us. And so what can you do with these chatbot-ish technologies? Well, you can take some text and you can turn it into a vector, which tells you which stores lots of information about what's in that text. And what's super interesting about these about this technology, first of all, it's a bidirectional encoder, which is to say, it looks at words before, it finds a focal word like AI, and then it looks at words before and after it, and it tries to put all of those words before and after the focal word into context to try and extract a semantic meaning from the whole sentence. So I know maybe some of you have seen, you're working with Siri and you're saying something to Siri and Siri starts typing in and then goes back and totally rechecks the sentences. No. As we're getting more information, we're going to update how the sentence works. So Google, to its credit, has these bidirectional encoders. My understanding is, though I haven't had a chance to look into it, is that Microsoft's chatbot is using what's called a decoder, which is a much more linear approach. Look at a word, go to the next word, go to the next word. And let me now make just a couple of quick asides. To say that Google is going to, that Microsoft has a much better product than Google, to me seems a little misleading. The encoders versus decoders each have pluses and minuses, and encoders tend to struggle a little bit more with semantics, but when they get it bang on. And now I understand that Google is trying to put encoders and decoders together. So to me, it seems like Google is just being appropriately cautious and doing the right thing in developing a new product. So I'm not giving up on Google just yet, though I'm delighted to see that MS has made such progress. Bottom line, these are technologies that have been around, constantly improving rapidly, but they've been around for some years now. And we certainly, in my group, we've been using it now for several years. So what we do is for each patent, for each AI patent, we get a vector representation of what it means, what it does. For each app, we go to its description of what it does. We apply the same procedure to create a vector that describes the meaning of what that patent does. Two vectors, we simply correlate them. If the correlation is high, we say that the firm's patent is being used in the firm's app. Okay, so super cool stuff. Once we've done that, we now can create a variable, which is how much AI, as measured by how many patents and how many patent citations are represented by the patents that the app is making reference to. And then we can run these gravity equations. So in these gravity equations, the underlying observations are an app in a year in an importing country. Okay, so we have for each app in each year in each importing country, we know how many people in that country are using the app. And then we can ask, does AI enhance the usage of these products? Does AI lead to better products? Does AI lead to new products? Does AI lead to this very important process of creative destruction, where the new apps displace the older apps? The AI apps displace the older non-AI apps. So we can answer all those questions. Schumpeter told us that this process of creating new products and destroying older, worse products is hugely important for long-term growth. Many of us in economics subscribe to that point of view. So we want to take our knowledge of how AI is enhancing this process of creative destruction and ask some simple welfare questions. So just a few pictures. When we regress how used is an app in any particular market, when we regress that on AI, our measure of AI, we get this positive coefficient, which basically says that AI increases the number of users of that app by very large numbers, like 3, 4, 5-fold. So AI really improves products and attracts users. So AI is definitely having a big impact on why these countries are going global, because they can really, by enhancing their product to AI, they can really forge ahead across many, many markets around the world. The next thing is whether a firm adopts AI is what economists call endogenous. That is to say, maybe good apps are then, if a company like Facebook develops a really good app, well, maybe it wants to enhance it with AI. So maybe it's the fact that the app is already good that leads the firm to adopt AI, rather than adopting AI enhances the app. So there's two-way causality here between how popular an app is and whether or not it uses AI. We use an IB strategy. I'm seeing it. I'm up for time, so I won't tell you specifically about it, except to say that it looks like most of the effects that you're seeing here are causally the result of AI leading to better products and not better products leading to the adoption of AI. And finally, I just want to talk about what we're finding is that AI leads to new products and AI leads to the displacement of old products. And so that should have important welfare implications for society. And conservatively, what we're finding is that those welfare gains are about increase the benefits of using mobile apps by about 20%. So very substantial benefits for society of the adoption of AI in this digital services space. Great, that's all I have to say. And Hannah, I guess I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so very much. That is so insightful. Oh, there's so many things I would like to ask and think about, and other people are too. But I'm just going to leave it and hand it over to Javier, who will take us on more of a policy side to this, right? You also have a paper. Yeah, exactly what I was going to say. Thank you, Javier. You read my mind. Go ahead.
Okay, so I hope that you can hear me and that you can see everything here. And
yes,
I must say I'm a bit intimidated in stopping Daniel talking, because that was really exciting, the paper that he's presented. It's a paper that I read with great interest. And in particular, because it brings, really exciting new evidence using a model that all of us here are sort of familiar with. And sort of when you look, and you've been doing work on the policy side of AI, and you look for empirical evidence, in the past, there was this paper by Brynjolfsson that highlighted the impact of, language translation models on trade and through different apps. But this one is further evidence highlighting what we thought we knew, and it's a really, really neat paper. So I really recommend that you read it, and I'm very excited to read the different versions that will come up here. What I want to do now is essentially provide you with an overview of the trade policy issues at the intersection of this debate, and this will draw on some work that I've done with my colleagues János Ferenc and Irene Olivan Garcia, and also maybe try and raise a question that Dan raised in his discussion. Will it replace jobs? But we're going to be talking about whether it will replace my job as a trade policy economist. But also I see a lot of friends around in the chat. So, I've seen Annie Rood and I've seen Hildegun. So, this also applies to you guys. So maybe let me just start by highlighting why AI matters for international trade, and in particular, how AI matters for the what and the how of trade. On the what's, we know that we're increasingly trading smart products, which combine the characteristics of goods, of services, and which are constantly connected. And Dan in his paper already highlights in the introduction sort of some of the ways in which our mobile phones are really part of this AI revolution. They're increasingly powered by AI. You can also think of our smart speakers. In terms of how we trade, it's changing the logistics. And now when we think about trade in parcels, it becomes very intuitive. When we order our mobile phones, when we order our power banks from our digital retailer, an AI system has already optimized that transaction and ensured that the item that you're ordering is actually much closer to you. And that's why you can have next day ordering. It's because AI has helped in organizing inventories and predicting demand and in improving efficiencies along the supply chain. But also when we think about customs, the way that customs deal with items is also done through AI, whether it's by looking at descriptions of items to match them with our harmonized system codes, or for counterfeited products, detecting them going through customs. And then last, there's the impact that AI can have, leading to greater productivity, which can be associated to gains of trade at the intensive and extensive margins, and also reductions in trade costs. And I think the proof is in the pudding. And this is something that was also said during Dan's presentation, that top innovators in AI are mostly multinational enterprises, and that we're seeing that most AI innovations are happening in highly traded sectors. Here I'm using foreign value added and final demand calculated using the TIVA database to capture international exposure. But also, it's important to note that trade also matters for artificial intelligence. So this figure, the top part of it essentially shows you the AI lifecycle with the design, data, and the models, and the verification, deployment, and operation. And this is taken from our colleagues at the OECD and the Science, Technology, and Innovation. And sort of what we've done here is try to add what we think might be the trade policy elements that might matter to the entirety of the AI value chain, which relates to hardware or goods, to software or services, to human expertise or people, and to cross-border data flows. And here's where I take a bit of a sort of a stop from the presentation to let you know that I asked the AI DALI, which is OpenAI's version of for creating images, to draw me a picture highlighting how international trade matters for artificial intelligence. And I asked it to do it in the style of Magritte, and this is what it came up with. It's not very legible and it doesn't really tell you very much. So I guess that humans may yet have the edge in creating the figures of the papers on international trade and artificial intelligence, which reassures me that my job might be secure for at least 1 or 2 years. But maybe going back to what the presentation of the AI policy means, we know that physical inputs into AI are important: high performance computing, data sensors, network equipment, and these are the result of highly internationalized global value chains. And so when you apply tariffs on these, you're clearly increasing the costs of access to AI technologies. So we think that you have to be careful with the tariff setting in order to help AI diffuse. At the same time, we think it's important to think about lowering trade restrictions for digital services. They are the software that is being used in the context of AI. But what we've been seeing with our digital services trade restrictiveness index, which maps cross-cutting issues that affect digital trade across, I think we have now 100 countries from 2014 to 2022, is that the measures that affect digital trade have not been going down, they've actually been going up. So we're increasingly facing a more restrictive environment, and that largely involved issues around infrastructure and connectivity. But it's also important to think about people and the movement of people. So AI is machine-based, but the people that write the code, the people that maintain the networks, they are important too. And what we're seeing is that entry conditions for AI professionals and computer engineers remain affected by barriers such as requirements to demonstrate a lack of suitable local labor supplies, or by burdensome application procedures or short permitted stay for different professionals. And last but not least, data, which is the key ingredient to AI systems. What we've been seeing here is that regulation affecting of movement is growing. And this involves policies that mandate that the data be stored locally, or measures that affect the movement of data, including through privacy and data protection regulation. Where it relates to data localization, we've seen that increasingly data localization requirements or local storage requirements are increasingly combined with storage and flow prohibitions. These are much more generally directed to specific sectors, but the worrying trend is that we're becoming increasingly restrictive in our approaches, as shown by the green shade in that graph. So what do we take away from the paper? Well, first of all, that the relationship between trade and AI goes in two directions. AI is important for trade, but also trade is important for the diffusion of AI technologies. If you want to take better advantage of AI, you might want to look at easing barriers to trade in ICT goods that are essential for AI systems, providing an enabling environment for regulation in trade and services, facilitating access to human expertise, and enabling data-free flows with trust. But we need a lot more empirical analysis, like the work that Dan is doing, to really highlight the benefits that are associated with AI technologies. And it's only then that we'll really be able to push a proper evidence-based message for the policymakers. Let me perhaps conclude with a final slide with my guest author, ChatGPT, where I asked it to write me a killer slide for the end of this presentation, and it entitled it, "The Future of International Trade Lies in the Hands of AI." And it's sort of, I'm not going to read it, you can see it, it's there. It highlights exactly what I was highlighting through my presentation, that we're becoming more interconnected, that AI technologies are transforming how we trade, and that embracing AI can allow you to gain a competitive advantage in the global marketplace. It also highlights the future of international trade, which is largely in the hands of AI and those who are able to embrace it. I would add to that that part of that means having the appropriate trade policy stance so that you are able to take advantage of this. And then at the end, it highlights that there are some challenges that we need to face. And sort of maybe taking a sidestep here, after reading this, it sort of made me think that maybe my job might be saved, not for 2 years, but maybe for the next 6 months. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion.
6 months, huh? All right.
I think it's a bit longer, Javier, because if you go back to that slide and you read about the irks of trade and AI, do you see that it made a mistake? It made it a flat out mistake, let alone the usual stuff, which doesn't give any attribution where it came to this information, but it made a mistake.
What is the mistake? Sorry, we must.
Instead of saying risks, it says irks.
Ah, the irks.
You don't want it to be in charge of the nuclear button just yet.
Indeed.
That's why it's 6 months and not 2.
But also none of us, just you caught the mistake though, Dan. So that's also on me and Ben there too. Not Javier even. So Dan, do you wanna go back first, or what do you want to do?
No,
do you want to comment on?
No, Javier, that's just totally interesting, and I'm glad that you're producing a huge amount of information. I will be going back to your digital restrictiveness index, and I'm going to be using it in my own work within the next for sure 4 weeks. So that's hugely important. It's interesting how you see in some of the examples that you gave how we get manipulated by AI. It's perhaps worth noting that AI does logistics for us. So as Javier was giving the example of, say, how Amazon, when you go to Amazon and you say, I want this book, and it says we only have 3 in stock. That's just pressure tactics. What they're saying is, as Javier was commenting on, they're going to ship, they have 3 books that they've shipped close to you. They have, 1,000 in stock, but they want to tell you, oh, it's going to disappear quickly. There's only 3 close to you. Well, by tomorrow they could have 10,000 close to you. And then the other thing is that picture that Chat GPT put up. It looked a little bit like actually the Shiriko, so actually it wasn't that far off. It had that ominous tone. Great.
Excellent. So I see there are questions coming in, and actually Leonard's question was very close to what I was going to ask. Do you want to do this, Ben? I mean, it's just, there's always so much interest.
I'm happy to have a first go at a question. So there's a few interesting ones that have come in. I'm a data guy, so I'm going to go with Hildegun's question, which was about data. So, for those of us who've been working on services and this whole area of kind of digital services, and now AI as part of that has come up, Dan, I think one of the most fascinating things that you do in the paper is actually find this great source of data. What else can we think about using to try and track these sorts of, non-traditional trade flows? Because so much of trade analysis, we're still working through the harmonized system and goods and all this kind of stuff. Where do we go? And thinking again of PhD students in the room, if you want a good project, where do you go to get this new and interesting data on emerging areas of trade?
You're just limited by your imagination. So let's remember that I am an old guy. I don't do social media. I don't have a Twitter account that I use and so on. But the PhD students, you're so savvy on what's happening in the virtual world. Just ask yourself, what am I doing? What are all my friends doing? Is there an international trade component to it? If there is, where do I find the data? Is it going to be from a commercial provider? Lots of big firms like Alibaba, et cetera, have their own research divisions, and you can approach them and say, hey, I'd like to use your data for the following. The number, I know Facebook has it, Alibaba has it. There's lots of companies that do it. So I see researchers all the time using individual companies' data. So you should think about that. And when you think about your proposal, what you have to do is say, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. What's in it for the company? How can you help the company be better? And with that attitude, lots of things are possible. The other thing where I'm currently heading is just text analysis. Massive numbers of documents are online, including government documents. So we're using that to start thinking about how to document subsidies databases. And I know I'm not alone in that. There's some lovely work being done by, say, Nathan Lane on that. So lots of data out there. I just found a new one from Javier. So a classic example of how to use, or the best example of how to use these types of data that are available online is David Yang has a couple of papers about facial recognition. And the way he did it is he went to the publicly available Chinese government documents on Chinese contracts. If you're not familiar with that database, there was a really lovely article in the New York Times using that database that you can get familiar with it. And then he simply asked, what contracts did the government hand out for facial recognition, and what types, because they know which part of the government is doing it. Was the police force, was the military, who was doing it? Was it the metro system, and so on? And then now he knows how government contracts are helping companies develop their facial recognition. And then he goes to the companies and says, okay, you did this contract for, say, the police in some city in China. Can we now use what we learned to develop a product that we could sell, say, to Saudi Arabia? So there's a lot of data out there. It's just your imagination that limits it. If you're looking for a good list of current research that hasn't made it to the journals, just go. We run out of the University of Toronto NBR's Economics of AI. Go to that. There's a website where all the presentations are available, and you can see what's sort of the cutting edge, what people are doing, as of whatever it was, as of last September.
Yeah, I think that's a great resource. So I do recommend that to people. The other question that that I wanted to ask is about the patent data. So we've had a couple of questions in chat about the patent data. Could you maybe just talk a little bit more about that and sort of, how far can we interpret the patent data in terms of, the variables that we normally think about, like location, origin, these sorts of things. And, how can we also interpret the patent data in terms of kind of not just the idea and the existence of the technology, but its incorporation in the application? And I know you've got a particular technique that you do where you're comparing the text. Are there any tests that you've done to establish a level of confidence in how well those things line up?
Right. So 2 parts to it. So the first part of your question is what we've done to feel comfortable with what we're doing. So we actually just eyeball and make sure. I had a slide example of it in a longer presentation, but we looked at a Google patent for maps. It is extremely highly correlated with the Google Map app.
Mm-hmm.
It's extremely highly correlated with, I'm not sure if it was Tencent or I think extremely highly correlated with Alibaba's map app. It was not correlated with Google's YouTube app. And certainly not correlated with, I can't remember, an Alibaba streaming website. So we have lots and lots of examples where we've tried just visually to say, does this make sense? It would be good to do something more formal, but that's where we're at this point.
That's great.
Do you want to jump in, Hannah?
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's so much interest here. And as usual, we have a huge LinkedIn group. So it's a good place to keep the conversations going. And both Dan and Javier are okay with people reaching out and continuing to ask questions in case somebody's sitting there and getting sort of panicked by all the information that's coming on here. And I also think that this might actually be a scope for something that we could do within the TPR forum, as we're always growing. And if in case there's some investors out there or sponsors that would be interested in finding a way to do this within the group, that would be super cool, I think. I would just like to ask broad questions. So it's unusual for someone who's such a high level academic as Dan to be on the policy side, diving into that. So I would like to sort of turn the tables and ask Dan, so regulatory wise, policy wise, what do you think is the most important question or policy message to come across? And for Javier, then I would like to know what sort of research would be useful for the OECD.
Great. So I have a bit of a mantra when it comes to public policy. I have a few of them, but one that's particularly relevant here is we can ask hard questions for which we have no solution, or we could ask about how do we solve a difficult problem, and say this really is the main problem of our times, but then we will struggle finding an answer. Or we can start with what is an important problem that I think I really can answer. Excuse me just for a second. Well, it looks like my focus is dying on me. So I tend to be in the second, to emphasize the second, which is what's the problem that we can solve. If you ask me what's a big problem that I have no solution for, it is the damage that that AI will do to society, especially to democratic institutions, and a tool it will become for autocracy. There is no single bigger problem in my mind, and the ability of AI, through that process, the ability of AI, for example, to take us into war or to take us from democracy to autocracy. So those very much preoccupy me. And the cost of war is staggering. We think the cost of just the Iraq, the second Gulf War, all in, including all the follow-on costs, it could have reached as much as $5 trillion. It makes everything that the US government do seem like small potatoes. The cost of war is huge. And so AI with its dual use aspects, as well as its ability to propagate fake news, I just want to remind people about fake news is not new to AI. It's just been amplified by it. The US went to war with Spain in 1898 over fake news, the sinking of the Maine. The United States went to war with Vietnam on fake news, the Gulf of Tonkin. The United States went to war with Iraq on fake news, weapons of mass destruction. It's always, Russia went to war with Ukraine on fake news, first about Crimea, and then later on about Nazis in Ukraine. So fake news is AI is so good at fake news. It deeply worries me. I don't have a solution for that. I would love if we could turn off our amplification engines, but I don't see how that's going to happen in the current US climate. Something that we can solve is not to stop thinking about big questions, but to focus on some smaller questions. And that is AI, yes, it's a set of algorithms, but the use cases for AI are very, very diverse. And to think about harmonize, and Javier, you said essentially the same thing during your talk. So we want to think about solving individual use cases. How do we harmonize AI regulations for particular use cases? One that would be high on my list would be, for example, therapeutic interventions, like solving a particular type of cancer, which has big problems for AI because the data are very fragmented and privacy keeps that data fragmented. China is trying to do something about that. They're trying to centralize data within China to make so that they can have better AI in their country. To some extent, I applaud that. A little caution about privacy issues when brought to a North American context or a European context. But I applaud the idea that certain types of data, like our healthcare records, there's a little bit too much privacy for the sake of the public good. Another example, we're going to have a whole host of technologies, say like autonomous vehicles, which are going to need international harmonization of regulation of standards. We already have in place a system for that. The United Nations, for example, in 3G, 4G, 5G, and now we're doing 6G. How are those standards developed? The United Nations says it's time for 3G, a 3G standard. Then that goes to an organization called 3GPP, which says, okay, here's a bunch of stakeholders, usually governments and individual firms who have expertise in the area. They then say, okay, to make this happen, here's 100 work items that we need to solve. And then companies or consortiums of companies come up with a standard for that one work item. And then the whole collection of all of those standards, and then that standard is approved by vote, usually unanimously approved. And then we have the standard. So what we probably need, and I suspect that we have the beginnings of it already, something like 3GPP for specific use cases of AI.
It's always hard to overlook the very important work that standards organizations do and regulations actually have in our everyday life. Javier, what sort of research would you really value?
I mean, I think I'm completely aligned with what Dan has said, and in particular with, I think the example of trying to find that balance between sort of benefits and concerns that may arise, including through privacy. And that's the really difficult bit. And so, for example, the work that Dan has done recently, is very strong in terms of highlighting the benefits of growing AI use in terms of, intensive, extensive margins in the humanitarian process. But what policymakers are also interested in is, at what cost, and are we willing to pay that cost? And sort of in particular, also, to what extent does this affect, some things like our ability to protect the privacy of individuals, and to what extent does this affect our ability to enforce sort of national security? So I think that for me, one of the areas where policymakers are increasingly asking us to do work is not just on estimating the benefits of using these technologies, but also helping them weigh out the sort of the trade-offs that they're making when they're choosing legislation like GDPR, which sets the bar on privacy very high. So I think on that side, what we're trying to do at the OECD is, complement that analysis by also giving them some of the sort of consequences that take place when they put measures like data localization. So for instance, we know that increased local storage requirements leads to a lower ability to exploit AI systems, particularly if you can't send AI threat data, for instance, across international borders. And so when they're putting a data localization measure, they might be doing it in light of maybe a national security concern, a privacy concern, or industrial policy, but that has other consequences. So I think then also drawing on what Dan has said, we need a lot more international collaboration on these issues, but these have to be evidence-based. We need a lot more on the benefits that are associated and to identify whether those benefits accrue to everyone in society and also across the globe, so to developing countries and to developed countries, but also look a bit more at the other side of the equation and in terms of legitimate public policy objectives, to what extent are these affected when we use different types of policies.
Yeah, sort of scary, I think, how fast these things are moving and the consequences of. Ben, there might be just a slight window for you if there's a last thing that you would want to touch on. Wonderful is short, as we say in Sweden. Boring lasts a long time, but this is short. You're muted.
Muted. Someone's always got to do that, or it's not a Zoom call.
Of course, thank you.
So I have a short question. The challenge is going to be giving a short answer, so I'll direct it to both our speakers. The reason I'm asking the question is that a few years ago, everyone was talking about 3D printing and the impact that that was going to have on international trade. And, folks in the international organizations, probably less at OECD, but more at the World Bank and these sorts of places, were very concerned with the potential that the technology had to isolate low and middle income countries from the global trading system. Then people, including at the World Bank, started doing research. And to my knowledge, the only research that's actually been published in a journal on 3D printing shows that it increases trade in goods rather than decreases it. And there are specific cases, even of US-Mexico trade, where you would expect the manufacturing to come back to the United States because to avoid transport costs. In fact, the factories in Mexico get upgraded to use the 3D printing technology, but the location stays in Mexico. So all of that surprised me. And so my question to you guys is, what do you think some of the surprises might be that will be in store for us as we learn more and more about the relationship between AI and trade?
Good question, Ben.
The surprise is going to be, there's not going to be too many surprises. We always overemphasize the new technologies and their impacts, and we de-emphasize the reasons why things change slowly. And I'll give you two reasons. One is adopting new technologies, and you've heard this many times, requires organizational change. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you've heard the stories about electrification, that 40 years out, only half of US companies had electrified factories. And even once it's electrified, you still have to rearrange the shop floor so that you take advantage of workflow in a way that you couldn't when you had other sources of power. So we're talking about not one, but two generations for electricity. And those are the kinds of, AI might be faster, but it's not. So far, we've been out since I date AI commercialization to 2012. We're moving slowly. We're moving very slowly. The other impediment, and this is going to be true about everything that has to do with international trade, is that a lot of manufacturing trade and even goods trade, service trade is taking place in highly concentrated geographic areas like Shenzhen for electronics. Moving clusters like that, taking a piece of a cluster and trying to move it somewhere else, the cost advantages are very little unless you can move the whole cluster. but you can't move the whole cluster. It's very difficult. And I'll finish with this point. Vietnam, if thinking about moving all of China to Vietnam, every man, woman, child, if you count them, that's 100 million people. China has about 110 million people working in manufacturing alone. We're not moving out of China anytime soon.
So I'll be very.
That's a great take. Yeah, Javier, do you want to have the last word?
Very quick, just to say on 3D printing that Inmaculada Martinez Terzoso is on the call, and she's got an excellent paper on 3D printing that's published, and that we at the OECD did some work on this. And I guess the lesson that we learned, which I think applies to AI, is that our imagination gets the better of us. And in some sense, when we think about 3D printing, we think about Star Trek and replicators. And I think in the same way, when we think about AI, we start making these sort of films in our heads about Terminator, Cyberdyne, and things like that. And so I think that what I've learned in my process is that careful analysis of the capabilities of the technology is really important to better understand these things. And sort of while AI is probably very good at doing my last slide of the presentation, it's not very good at doing my figures of the presentation. We need to take those sort of caveats and we need to think very carefully about the technology before we start making these crazy projections. We always overestimate what these technologies are going to do and how fast they're going to do it.
I think that's a great point to end on. So thank you very much to Dan and to Javier. That was a really fascinating pair of presentations. So, I personally got so much out of that. It's an area that I'm really interested in. And I feel like I had a really steep learning curve on this call. So I really appreciate everything that's gone into that. Thanks everyone for joining us. For those who joined us for the first time, we hope you'll come back and see us again. We have webinars approximately every month, always on a Thursday at 9 a.m. New York time. Our next one is on April 27th, and it will be on friendshoring. So everyone who signed up via the Zoom link, you'll get an email in a day's time with the sign up link for the next webinar. Otherwise, you can keep an eye out on Twitter and on LinkedIn. You can go to our website, which, as Hannah said, is being redone, and there you can sign up for our mailing list to make sure you know what we've got going on. So again, thanks very much to our speakers. Thanks to my partner in crime, Hannah, and thanks to everyone for attending. It was a really great session, and we hope to see you all again.
My pleasure.
Thank you so very much.
Thanks, guys.
Yes.
Bye-bye.